to our next event for the contingencies of care. As we know, many people will be here on site, and because we have multiple residents from different time zones, people will be checking in later on our YouTube site. So welcome to those folks as well. My name is Ashok Mathur. I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies and one of several members on the organizing team for Contingencies of Care. And one of them, two of them are here, Myung-sun and Candice Hopkins, who I'll talk about in one moment here. I want to begin by talking about land acknowledgements. And of course, I'm based in Toronto, and OCAD University, which is co-hosting this, is here. And in its brick and mortar format, we talk about the land in this way, that this is historically the land of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's also in Toronto, of course, it's the fourth largest urban population of Indigenous people. And it's also the site of a very strong site for the Métis community as well. I mention that, but I also recognize that many of us in this room, the Zoom room, are coming from different spaces. And I urge us, as it is the day following National Indigenous Day, to recognize those lands and where we're coming from. I also want to acknowledge that we've run through in the past couple of weeks some very difficult news, something very hard on to absorb and to process, although unfortunately not surprising news. And so I want us, I guess, to keep that in mind too as we go through our day to day and indeed our senses of care as we're going through our residency in total. As I've done before, the introduction I'm going to do is very, very bare bones, and I'll leave it to Tanya and Candice to pick up and say more about their work and themselves, should they choose to do so. But if people need to or haven't seen this, I'll post the link to in the site where you can get some more information. So very briefly, Tanya Lukin Linklater does an amazing amount of work in performance for camera installation, writing centers, writings that center the histories of Indigenous people's lives, lands, and structures of sustenance. And today what she's going to be doing is talking about a specific, I believe, a site-specific performance that will be the subject of the conversation with Candice Hopkins. And Candice, of course, is a respondent or a conversationalist in this case, and she works with as one of the partners with this residency with the Toronto Biennial of Art. So with that very, very brief introduction, I'm going to toss it over, I believe, to Candice to start, and then with Tanya, and then we'll proceed as we will. And I apologize, I'm going to pop out to meet a new group of graduates coming in, but I'm going to come back in and hear the most of it. So welcome everybody, and Candice, over to you.
Thank you, Ashok, and thank you everyone for joining us. I see that there is a nice group of Toronto Biennial folks in the room, so it's good to see your names here, and to the residents, thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure for me to be in dialogue with Tanya. I think every time we talk, I learn a new story. I learn to think about something differently. We've had many shared conversations about our interests in repatriation, our interest in our ancestors and the ways in which they worked, the ways in which they resisted, the kinds of lives that they lived, and how these lives are often, we can kind of feel, let's say, their resonances through not only, dance and performance today, but the things in which they made. I'm originally from the Yukon. I was born in Whitehorse, and my family is from Carcross-Tagish First Nation on my mom's side. So we're citizens of Carcross-Tagish First Nation. We're Tlingit. Tlingit folks came inland in part to trade, I think, in part to kind of fortify relations, trading relations with the Russians, who were really active at that time. But as far as I understand, we always migrated across, and even they say in songs, beneath the glacier. So my grandmother's family is actually from Klukwan in Alaska, Tlingit Village in Alaska. My dad's family are Welsh immigrants. And I think like many people who came to Canada, they were looking for a different kind of life, and they settled at mile 72 and a half of the Alaska Highway. So I was raised there as well. Sort of bushland, swamp spruce. It was actually much more remote than the Yukon. And so with that, I'll of course pass it on over to Tanya, but just to say that at the end of Tanya's presentation, we'll be in conversation together, but also to encourage you, if you have any questions, to pop them in the chat. We'll do our best to address them, or even, you know, we're such a small group that I think you should feel free to just turn your video on and ask if you have any questions directly. So over to you, Tanya.
Well, Chumai, I'm so happy to be in conversation today with Candice. And as she mentioned, we've been in conversation over several years, and I also learn every time when we visit with one another. And I'm going to share my screen a little bit today and speak a little bit today about a specific work, but also more generally just about some of my approaches in my work. And I wanted to begin by, introducing myself. My name is Tanya Lukin Linklater. I originate from the native villages of Afognak and Port Lions in the Kodiak Island archipelago of southwestern Alaska. I'm speaking today in Nipissing and Anishinaabeg territory, and I am a visitor to this land. I've lived here for over a decade. My ancestors are not from here. But over time, I've come to know good people here. I've come to grow friendships and to learn from the quiet strength of this land and the waters here. And I feel that living in this place at this time has given me the space to breathe, to reflect, to be in relation, and to think about my artistic work in relation, socially, politically, historically, and culturally. And as Ashok mentioned, when I sat down to compose this talk, I realized that this is a difficult talk to give, given our context, because of all that's been happening in Canada and abroad. Ongoing hardship and grief. I've been left at times without words as I quietly mourn, or I process what is happening in Kamloops, Taysha Wetmuk, in London, but also feeling a range of other emotions as there's been the removal of monuments across North America for several years now, and in more concentrated ways in Ontario recently. And also when I think about Black and Indigenous political movements, as these events affect us all, and as imperfect as my talk will be today, it is important to share and to be with one another. So I wanted to start in a little bit of a prologue by speaking about specifically the context of the pandemic, and to say that, this winter I listened to elders Wes Wheatung and Leona Stevens as they shared that this time of being in our homes and of being physically distanced from one another is a time for reflection for ourselves and our world. And they shared that some youth that they know and that they mentor are choosing to make regalia or undertake other forms of learning, so that when they look back on these 16 months, or however long the duration will be of the pandemic in the future, that they'll remember what it was that they undertook in their lives at this time. So I've been focused on this time on wellness for myself and my family, as many of the members of my communities have been and my colleagues have been. And we've been reflecting on and putting into practice strategies to bring ourselves into balance physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, sharing what we learn along the way with one another. And I've been thinking a great deal about sustainability during this time of rest, recovery, and also difficulty, politically, socially, culturally, and otherwise. I often consider that history is unfolding as we live it, as we stand against injustice, as we collectively contribute to our communities, as we generate a continuance of Indigenous life, in my case, as we continue to come to terms with our shared histories. And I think about this on many different registers and scales, for myself, for my children, for my extended family in Ontario and Alaska and elsewhere, for my friends, for this community that I live in, and my Alutiiq or Shulpiaq communities in Alaska. So today I will speak in 3 movements. The first movement is in relation to preparation. The second movement is in relation to felt structures as I conceptualize them. And the third is a discussion of treaty as a form of Indigenous knowledge, and a very brief discussion of the performance, how we mark land and how land marks us. So these movements will be marked by sharing excerpts of documentation from the performance. So the first movement, as I mentioned, is in relation to preparation. So if you can imagine the time before and when a baseball hitter steps up to the plate, they undertake a series of physical and mental rituals. Many athletes do this, but it is unseen by those of us who might be fans, as these physical and mental sets of preparation may take place out of sight, not on the field, not on the court, or they are invisible to us. The hitter not only warms up the body, the specific muscles needed to hit, but they also practice the motions of hitting a few times. Yet in many cases, they also repeat a series of physical gestures before they hit each time. And it might be tapping the plate with the bat, or kicking the bat with their toe, or gripping the bat, or getting their stance. But I also notice other smaller micro gestures that they do as well in preparation for the pitch. As they repeat this each time, they set themselves up to hit. I start with this example because perhaps you've watched or played baseball or softball, so you're familiar with it. Perhaps another example that you may be familiar with is the practice of smudging and opening an event or other gatherings with words from elders or knowledge holders and song. These openings are meant partly to open our hearts and our minds in a good way, to prepare us for the work we will undertake together at an event, to bring our minds together, as some elders have said before. Yet I had actually noticed preparation far earlier in my lifetime. Firstly, as a child, I watched, and as I grew, I pitched in during the intensive preparation my father undertakes prior to subsistence fishing of red salmon each season. So these are the first red salmon, or the first salmon to run in late spring near my villages on Kodiak Island. So from cleaning and painting the boat, including the removal of barnacles annually, to making sure that equipment is safe, to repairing nets, the list goes on. And these are months and months of preparation in anticipation of a very short time when the fish are running, perhaps 10 days in total for the late spring red salmon run. And often it might start around May 20th. So my dad has told me in the past, you have to be here when the fish are running. They're not going to wait for you. And so you don't know when they'll be running, but they might run around May 20th. I also remember experiencing live performance with Anupiak dance groups in Northern Alaska. And I first encountered Anupiak dance in Anchorage as a teenager. So Anupiak dances are often quite short, perhaps 90 seconds in length, although not in all cases. And often these are the dances shared outside of their villages. Anupiak songs and dances are often structured with 2 verses, or what we might call push-ups in powwow. Anupiak songs and dances, like many songs and dances in Alaska, are telling a story in dance. Or one Yupik woman has said, it's writing with the body. They're also telling the story in the sound of the drums and their singing voices in song language. And often these stories are about being in the mountains or on the tundra, the ocean, and animals they encounter there. A fight between 2 ravens, for example, which really stands out in my mind when I think about Anupiak dance. These are not always the stories that are told, but are the ones I can discern as a non-Anupiak person, as someone who doesn't speak their language or their dance language. I also like the not knowing the exact details sometimes as I watch and listen. So in the first push-up, which is what I'm calling it within the context of powwow dance, but in the first push-up, the dancers mark the dance, meaning that their gestures are smaller. They bend their knees lightly. They gently place their hands in different configurations, but do not fully extend their arms or their hands. The singers also bring their voices to the gathering with a smaller sound, and they tap the sides of their drums, which has a quieter effect in the space, on the dancers, on the people gathered to listen, and on one another. Here, in the first push-up, in this first glance of the dance and the first sounds of the song, they are preparing themselves, the viewers and listeners, for the sensations that they will experience momentarily when their voices gather fullness, when we hear the drums in their larger sound and the dancers express a full athleticism. Similarly, I often remember my times at Alaska Native, Inuit, and Dene Games in Alaska and Alberta. I never was an athlete competing in these international and circumpolar games, although they do teach the games in gym class in some of our communities across the north. But I do love to spectate. Specifically, I noticed the tremendous coaching, the support that is expressed and communicated to these northern athletes before they extend themselves into the full position of the force and grace of their movements. And when they fail to meet the target, which is often a small stitch ball covered in seal fur, not always, but in some cases, with a high kick or a reach, they are coached again. They get a few attempts, and what I notice is not only their athleticism, which is remarkable, but it is the community around them of their fellow athletes, their coaches, their parents, their family members encouraging them. You may notice that I cited examples of athletics and cultural practices. This is partly as I have an interest in both and embody practices generally. It's also because I believe that in these fields, there is a state we are seeking, sometimes called flow, a state at which our minds, bodies, and perhaps our spirits are in alignment in the actions that we are undertaking individually and collectively. We can also find a state of flow in other activities, but these are perhaps the ones I'm most familiar with and have observed over time. I think that perhaps we are perpetually in a state of preparation. Perhaps this is what we are doing as we attempt to come into balance physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We are continuously undertaking incremental daily practices, which leads me to a very brief discussion of insistence that I'll pick up later. These micro gestures, these sets of ongoing preparations accumulate into experience, knowledge, and a way of being in the world. These sets of daily practices can affect change in the world, and also they constitute the building of a life. So during the pandemic, I've asked myself a series of questions over the last 16 months. What does it mean to sustain a practice of care and well-being in my life? What does it mean to sustain relationships or to fulfill my responsibilities in relation to family and community? What does it mean to sustain a professional practice, to sustain my education, to sustain a writing or artistic practice? What does it mean to sustain Indigenous practices in my life? And I continuously return to the small daily activities that I undertake that build towards the sustainability that I'm seeking. As these can accumulate over time into larger practices of centering our commitments to our well-being, to our families, to our communities, to our work. But the building blocks for these larger commitments take place daily. So I'm going to share my screen now as I've completed that first movement on preparation. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to enter into the movement 2 section of the talk. So a counter to the duration of colonial time offered in the literature is the duration of Indigenous persistence, survivance as theorized by Vine Deloria Jr., or what I have come to write about, insistence as repetition, or an accumulation over time of repeated embodied acts that resist and persist through what Leanne Simpson has called apocalyptic conditions. Theorists and scholars in Indigenous studies write of these durations as a kind of testament to our collective survivability in the face of ongoing assaults over centuries through the continuing structures and activities of settler colonialism. Our communities, as shown in our commitments to recover tradition, are responding to the urgency of violence by seeking to recover practices that provided protection to our peoples for generations. Seeking this protection, repair, and recuperation of ourselves, our families, and communities, we are returning to the ephemeral structures that kept us for millennia. Indigenous peoples propose that a return to and recovery of Indigenous thought, languages, practices, and affective worlds are reparative and restorative for our families, peoples, and communities. The history of Indigenous communities' theorization of and political action towards Indigenous knowledge recovery in response to not only settler colonial systems, but I would also suggest, as Candice Hopkins and I have discussed more recently, colonialisms as a plural, is evident collectively on a larger scale by the 1960s. So Alutiiq peoples in my homelands have undertaken a process of recovery, restoration, and repair initiated by our communities since the early 80s through many activities. And my practice arises within this context and history and is informed by anti-colonial resurgent Indigenous movements more broadly. My work is committed to a continuum of time that is generational and centers Indigenous experiences. So I'm now going to turn to this discussion of felt structures as the second movement. A continuous ephemerality may describe air and its perpetually moving currents, different formations that, while pattern cannot be fixed, the atmosphere is constituted by air that is invisible yet surrounds or envelops us, moving us in the rise and fall of our chests and bellies, in the quiet expanse of our rib cages with each inhale, the suspension and empty pauses between exhales. The continuousness of breath, a cycle embodied moment by moment, is shared amongst us, yet in our body in this moment right now. Each of us partakes in this shared breath that is everywhere at all times, yet unseen. This breath is connected to the clouds, to plant life, and shared in each sip and gulp. I come to this talk by looking at times to the sky, considering the ways that clouds lit by the sun at dusk and dawn make visible the air that we sense as ephemeral and ever-changing, this elusive materiality that is of our bodies and the world simultaneously. Indigenous scholar Kristen Simmons describes settler atmospherics and their role in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous violences in Black Lives Matter and at Standing Rock partly as, quote, the conditions we breathe in are collective and unequally distributed, with particular qualities and intensities that are felt differently through and across time. I describe felt structures as usually unseen except in moments, sensed, embodied, and ever-changing. I consider felt structures to have unfolded in iterative and cumulative ways over time in my artistic practice, and specifically in more concentrated ways during the generation of a series of projects in recent years. Instigated by questions in relation to embodiment, ancestral belongings, and how I'm coming to understand the undercurrents and atmospheric qualities of felt structures, the idea of felt structures has been extended and amplified through the process of making. And in writing that I'm currently undertaking, my understanding of felt structures is brought more sharply into being. I propose that felt structures are invisible, surrounding us and our ancestral belongings in the old days, affecting our minds and structuring the world. They were and perhaps continue to be an organizing force. And in these felt structures, sight is restricted, We rely on our other senses in the processes of perception, discernment, and response. So many sets of systems have historically dispossessed and contained Indigenous peoples' ancient ancestral knowledges, which I spoke to briefly earlier at the beginning of this movement. The removal of us from our lands and the attempted breaking of Indigenous structures may be understood, as I said earlier, as activities that make up ongoing colonialisms that over time have misplaced and displaced our embodied knowledges. Felt structures, while imbuing our breath and energetic body, ancestral belongings, and other material forms, inhabit other atmospheres. They are characterized by their constant motion, impermanence, shifting, fading, density in moments, and dissipation in others, like cloud cover. However, unlike the regularity of storms moving across the continents following air currents, the patterns of their arrivals and departures are encoded. My work is in relation to the recovery of and generation of felt structures as reparative actions. The work of reaching back to our ancestors is partial, as we cannot recover and restore the full complexity of these felt structures as they existed within a ritual elutic universe prior to Russian contact. Yet, felt structures may also be enacted as a set of ethics that guide our actions in the present moment, as a kindness towards our ancestors and to the world at large, embodied knowledge practices that hold a future potential. Felt structures frame and form are the action of and are generated by my work. Felt structures are simultaneously past, present, and future becoming. So I've shared just a couple of images here, and I'm going to move into the next excerpt of How We Mark Land and How Land Marks Us. So I'll move into movement 3. And in this section, I'm going to speak a little bit about treaty. Quote, "The elders maintain that the land belongs to their peoples as their peoples belong to the land." That's the late Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrandt in the Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan. Our dream is that one day our peoples will one day be clearly recognized as nations. So in 2001, when I was 25, I was introduced to this text, Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan, by the late Maisie Cardinal. Maisie was the spouse of the late Harold Cardinal, and he had studied law, spent much time learning with elders in Alberta about law rooted in Indigenous knowledge structures, and was instrumental in key movements nationally. I also came to meet the late Harold Cardinal. And for context, I was the instructional assistant for Maisie Cardinal at the time at University of Alberta. So my understanding of Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan was limited as it addresses a deep kind of Indigenous knowledge that does not belong to me. Indeed, it is clear in the text that these forms of Indigenous knowledges are obtained through rigorous discipline within specific cultural protocols, are acquired over time, and are deeply embedded within Indigenous languages. However, I understood the premises within the text, gathered through extensive formal conversation with elders across Saskatchewan, that Indigenous peoples from different nations could share specific foundational concepts. I've been thinking about treaty and feeling connected to or a part of treaty since that time. The Treaty's Elders of Saskatchewan was published in 2000. In the preface, Harold Cardinal and Walter Hildebrandt, writers, explain that, quote, the theoretical framework provided was the result of a combined effort by elders from the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, and Assiniboine nations. The treaties are understood within this theoretical framework, and, quote, for the Saskatchewan elders, this treaties negotiated by their nations with the British Crown after 1874 arose from the teachings and prophecies arising from their spiritual traditions. Their analysis of treaties is centered upon the framework of their spiritual traditions. And key to this analysis is a sense of time and history. Quote, the elders begin by locating the history of their nations in North America in a time continuum stretching thousands of years, starting with the beginning of time itself. The elders view the treaties as part of that First Nation historical continuum. The treaties are described by the elders as vows to one another and as a covenant relationship between First Nations, the Crown, and the Creator. And as a result, they are unchangeable in nature. Within these relationships are deep responsibilities to one another and to the land, emphasizing sharing. Cardinal and Hildebrandt explain the duties and obligations that arise from the laws, ceremonies, and traditions that through a way of life for the First Nations are clear. The elders, for example, explain that when promises, agreements, or vows are formally made to the Creator, and please excuse my broken Cree or my, I don't fully know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Wio Tawimo, through ceremonies conducted in accordance with the laws governing them. The promises, agreements, or vows so made are irrevocable and inviolable. Quote, the elders have been unequivocal in their statement that the treaties cannot be changed or altered. So learning about treaty is a rigorous, deep study earned over time, and it is likely a life's work to fully understand treaty. And while the knowledge can be earned through specific actions, the rights to this knowledge is also partially, at least I believe, inherited. The processes for earning the knowledge of treaties is deeply connected to the ways in which the treaties themselves were enacted, with the pipe, feast, and gifts. Photographic documentation or descriptions of treaty show the symbols of feasting, gift giving, as well as singing that were enacted. So at the center and the root of the treaties is peace that is specifically rooted in kinship or good relations. And so I know I'm quoting this text quite a lot, but it's a quite important text and quite foundational in sort of my understanding of treaty. So Cardinal and Hildebrandt explain, quote, peace, according to First Nations definitions, is more than just an undertaking that there would be no war between the parties. The First Nations terms speak to the positive undertaking of the parties to nurture and root their treaty relationship in the principles of good, healthy, happy, respectful relationships, Mio Wichetuan, as symbolized by the laws governing relationships between cousins. So this poses a question about feelings and sense perceptions of treaty connected to larger publics. So specific groups of Indigenous peoples in Saskatchewan and Alberta understand treaty in relation to their spiritual worldviews. And this is perhaps the issue, that this understanding, which is foundational to treaty, is not a shared understanding with contemporary Canadian publics or with the Canadian government. Yet despite the general public and Canadian government's refusal to share in these Indigenous understandings of treaties, often saying, referring to just the written document and not the spirit and intent of the treaty, these understandings still remain with the people. And I might say that they're felt as it is a shared feeling, even if only with one another and the Creator. This is significant when we consider that feelings can signal, provide insight prophetically through intuition, and reflexively through memory. And all of this reminds me of Chief Teresa Spence's 44-day hunger strike or fast in the winter of 2012 and 2013. So some of you may be familiar with this history and some of you may not, but this political action was steeped in an Indigenous embodiment of an idea, a deep belief in and commitment to treaty, which is the foundational relationship in Canada that structures Indigenous and non-Indigenous people's relationships and our relationship to the land. Treaties are not only about our shared histories and our past, but also our shared future on Turtle Island. So I'm just going to speak very briefly to this project, as I know I've already spoken for quite a while. I'm just going to say that I was in residence at Mallory Landing, Thousand Islands National Park for 6 days in June 2017 as a part of the Landmarks 2017 project, which really was coming out of a celebration of Canada 150. And I felt that if I were to be a part of this Landmarks 2017 project, I did need to address treaty in the work. I was accompanied by a trio, including Laura Ortman, who is a White Mountain Apache amplified violinist and composer who's been based in New York City for 20 years, dancer choreographer Hanako Hoshimi-Keynes, who's based in Montreal, and Muskogee Creek Cherokee artist-composer Elisa Harkins from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And it was an immersive experience where we kind of lived together and cooked together over this short period of time, right on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. And I will say that you may have noticed that the water was very high. There was a great deal of flooding at that time. So it was actually quite peaceful for us to be there because there were very, very few boats that were in the river at the time. Although one day I remember suddenly noticing a really large tanker that was moving through the river. So this residency and performance was curated by Tanya Willard and affiliated with a graduate course in Indigenous public art taught by Dr. Dylan Robinson at Queen's University. And I was selected to produce a commissioned site-specific performance in Akwesasne Mohawk territory in the smallest national park in Canada on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. So in our graduate course, we had discussed the ways in which signs within parks curate the gaze and how these signs mediate our experiences of parks and the land itself. But it was my intention in this performance to decenter the gaze while centering an experience of listening. And listening can be described as the ability to accurately receive and interpret messages in the communication process. It may be focused or concentrated, sometimes physical. However, perhaps a different way to understand listening is to consider Dylan Robinson's discussion of listening as a form of embodied witnessing, which includes listening to the land. This is the smallest national park in Canada, Thousand Islands National Park. And however, it's been slowly growing over time from donations, land purchases, and crown land that's been given to the park. But in an opposing process, Indigenous communities, which were previously much larger parcels of land, have continued to diminish in size sort of alongside that process. And First Nations are continuously in the courts over land disputes with the Canadian government today. I think that's all I'll say for now, and I will kind of let you view just the last excerpt and then we can move into conversation.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm a bit speechless, honestly. I didn't, you brought so many things to the table with such generosity, and the way you've structured what you've shared with us as 3 movements means that what you've done as well is brought us in on this, this perpetual process, as you say. So thank you for that. I'm very grateful to also see this work, which I hadn't seen before, also to hear it. I have a few things I wanted to speak about. I'm sure other people have things that they want to speak about as well. One, I wanted to bring us back to this point because I think that it's a very important one. You spoke of, you cited Gerald Visner and survivance. I think for many of us, when he wrote about survivance, and it was, more than 2 decades ago now, I believe, he was making the point that we didn't simply survive. We haven't survived, which kind of puts that in a past tense. Survivance is an active, present, and future condition. Where I think you've extended that is to think about or bring forward another idea to build on that, which is insistence. Insistence as not the act of insisting, but I think the embodiment of what that might mean. You've spoken about process and preparation. You've talked about how these cycles not only rupture colonial time, but actually break it. I think they actually break it. Colonial time wants to be linear. Colonial time wants to extract from us. Colonial time wants to take and take and take. And colonial time wants to monetize everything. So what I was seeing in what you shared with us is, both your analysis of more ancient dance forms that, in a way create future conditions, but also this work, which it's kind of how, the land marks us and we mark the land, about breaking, not only breaking that time, but reiterating how these choreographies and these performances, we insist that they continue, let's say. So that's not really a question, but I was hoping that you could speak more about, your idea of insistence and your idea of process and why that's so important in the work that you do, also your writing.
Yeah, I really appreciate your sort of bringing together these disparate ideas, as I often am trying to place them in relation to one another, and they don't always make a sort of a linear essay where one idea leads into the other, because they're sort of circular and sort of looking back on themselves and reflexive. And so I really appreciate you kind of thinking alongside me, and I hope that I haven't sort of overwhelmed the viewers today by placing these ideas alongside one another. But certainly these are sort of my longer term concerns. And I think what I mean to say partly is that as a part of this discussion, whether it's in sort of the Indigenous knowledge foundations of treaty, or these older dances, Anupiak dances, or Inuit athletics and the ways in which they're happening today. All of these are very small gestures. They're very small things that begin with very small daily actions, but that even in the midst of these violent systems and colonialisms that have continued to extract land or try to structure our minds and ourselves by removing, language acquisition, or by the attempt through legislation to break down our, practices in health and wellness and education and governance. People have continued to do this. People have continued to gather sweetgrass on the land, or, maple syrup in the spring, which is something that happens here where I live in Anishinaabe territory. People have continued to dance their dances and sing their songs, even though they, were very much legislated against, that it was illegal for them to do this in Canada. They kept those practices, they took them underground, and there were certain people who held on to them. And then now, over the last several decades, there's been this sort of continuous return to this ancient and embodied knowledge that, as I've said, has kept us for multiple millennia. So really, I try to say that this work that I'm undertaking is just situated within these larger histories that are happening with Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. So in the Nibissing-Anishinaabe territory where I live, Alutiiq or Shulkbiak communities in Alaska, in the Cree communities who have held on to this Indigenous knowledge around treaty. And I would say also, although I know less about the Mohawks of Akwesasne and the territory, the Thousand Islands National Park, which is situated within their territory. These are larger continuous actions that are happening in really decentered ways in remote communities, not necessarily always in view, although with social media, we have more access to see the documentation of this happening in real time. But for a long time, and still is the case, people are continuing these practices that are shared amongst their families and in their communities, and seeking out this knowledge, not as a direct resistance to oppression, but all of these small actions that happen accumulate over time and build towards that resistance. And we have had many thinkers and writers like Vine Deloria and others, Leanne Simpson and many others, Audra Simpson, who have written about this and sort of provided those larger frameworks, or provided that information. Harold Cardinal was another one who was a part of these sort of national movements politically and culturally and socially. And so I just try to cite these folks because my work is coming out of that larger commitment, those anti-colonial movements, those resurgent Indigenous practices. I think too that I've come to learn, I think this is partly just getting older. It's like, how do we structure our day? What do we do in a day? How are we living our lives on a daily basis? Because that really is the building of a life. And so that's just sort of like a personal reflection of, am I making time to be on the land? Am I making time to go to ceremony? Am I making time to subsistence fish? Am I making that time to share what I know with my children, and continue to learn? So for me, it's my artistic practice is connected to these sorts of larger concerns that I have around what I described as a continuance of Indigenous life, or insistence.
Thank you for that answer. I have so many questions, but one that I'm thinking about is related to the second movement, and you spoke about it briefly now. And that is when you were speaking about treaty, an earlier work that you've done was called Treaties in the Body. I was thinking about how treaty, as you said, is a binding agreement that's not simply between people. I think it was Harold Cardinal who said it's also with the Creator. I've been thinking lately, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, because there's been a lot of talk about the potential of the land back movement. You've already noted that the trends in native lands, whether it's reservation land or otherwise, tend to decline rather than grow, right? That's always, has been the trend since the beginning. And we were talking about, what about the possibility of the land back movement actually not be a treaty between people, but a treaty with the land? So what if, the well-being, the care, and the laws of the land actually defines nationhood? Understanding nationhood as multiplicity. It's not like the nation of Canada. It's also our own native nations. Does that, reframe, or can that reframe how we understand treaty? Can that reframe how we understand the rights of the land, not the rights to the land, which I think, the elders understood very, very well. But also, does that reframe how we understand justice? There's law, but there's also justice. Is treaty then part of the action of restorative justice?
Well, I think that these are questions of our time that certainly I just have a very small contribution to, and there are some key people who would have different ideas and different contributions to how to think through these really important questions. Sorry, if you noticed sounds in the background, it's my children, so just they're with us. I've heard people speak about this before, this idea of treaty with the land. I feel as though embedded within this sort of rigorous, deep knowledge about treaty, these ideas are embedded within that. These ideas of our relationship to the land, which is relational. It's about honoring the land and honoring, within these views, the land also has agency. Mother Earth also has agency. Mother Earth also has a voice, So I think that embedded within the sort of original intentions of treaty from an Indigenous perspective, or, this group of elders in Saskatchewan have described, that is embedded within it. However, Gina Starblanket has also cautioned, that we don't want to romanticize treaty, because we know that the Crown had other intentions in the signing of treaties around the ceding of land and the surrendering of land, and also other intentions. And so I am mindful that I don't want to romanticize it. I would say that I don't know that we need to make a treaty with the land, because I feel like embedded within our ways of being human and the original teachings that have been shared with us in our respective communities, whether you're Alutiiq or Shukpiaq, or whether you're Cree or Anishinaabe or Tlingit, that I think embedded within that are these ways of being in relation that honor the land and do not take a sort of extractive position with it. The other thing I might mention in terms of nationhood is that Jody Bird and Mashana Goman have both written about thinking about nationhood differently, thinking about nationhood less as within a sort of Western framework and more within Indigenous frameworks of being in relation and of kinship and of being sort of returning to perhaps some of our values as Indigenous people around who we bring into community and how we're in relation to those in community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking that performance was exemplifying this, because I was listening when Laura began playing the violin, and what you heard as well was this rhythm of the water hitting the shore. Her violin didn't drown out the sound of that rhythm of the water hitting the shore. Yet her violin was also not mimicking that rhythm. It was kind of creating these overlays, these resonances, as though she was playing alongside it. As though, you realize that we've always been doing this. I think we've always been improvising and improvising is actually, I think, being in a state of extreme relation because you're doing it in the moment. So you have to be incredibly open. And then as your two collaborators, as the dancers began, I saw what I saw that they were doing was almost like molding their body to that rock, lifting themselves up, making you aware of how our bodies become a tether between the earth between our feet and the sky above. And you said something around then or before or after, I don't know, the land belongs to the people and the people belong to the land, which might have been a citation. And then Laura kind of turned and you realized that then what she was doing was playing not only alongside the water, but now alongside the dancers and actually being the bridge between both of them. And to me, that was a really remarkable moment because then it kind of expanded this idea of, what you were just describing as being in relation. It expanded, I think, this idea of kinship. It did exactly like you wanted, which was decentering the gaze and recentering our listening. But it brought my sense of perception even more acutely aware of both the rock and the water. So I wanted to mention that because I think that you often work as what you call a kind of process of open rehearsal, and you haven't said that yet in this talk, but I wondered if you wanted to speak at all about that kind of, I would say, a deliberate openness to enable all of these different becomings, because some people who work in your field, some people who work in choreography tend to want to tightly control every moment, everything that happens, every movement, every moment. And I don't feel like you do that. So I was curious if you could speak about that more.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your beautiful sort of description of what was occurring in those moments. And I mean, I think I often say that I'm able to bring not only ideas in relation to one another, but just really good folks, so someone like Laura, who has this accumulation of a lifetime of experience of being with her amplified violin and many different settings and situations, brings this acute sort of ability to perceive and discern what is taking place in that location in that time. I think it was also really important that we were in that site for the 6 days, that was an important sort of time of just being in relation. I also have a longer history of making site-specific performances, although I haven't been doing that as often. Although it happens within open rehearsals in the museum, but often in relation to objects in exhibition or ancestral belongings, particularly in the last few years. But I have a kind of innate sort of responsiveness to sight. And I think by being there collectively together, we're able to recognize the sort of terrain, recognize the sort of interesting space of the shore, of being in relation to the St. Lawrence River and the rock and the sky simultaneously. And that has become a really important part of my work generally. My son is downstairs in a session, so if that's bleeding over into this session, I apologize.
You're a little bit, don't worry.
There's sort of like simultaneous conversations happening in our household right now. I think that, yes, this work is also quite open. So I've, selected a series of moments, but there's many other actions that are occurring within the performance that I feel like the sort of 3 moments that I've chosen to share in the talk today sort of distill some of these ideas very, very clearly. There are these moments where things that I was sort of investigating become really clear to me, sort of looking back at the performances. This was in 2017. But there's also a freedom within the work. There's a kind of looseness that I really love and that I want to return to as a practice, as things have gotten a little bit tighter in some of the work that I've been producing the last couple of years. It looks like we might have some questions, or I might turn it back over to you, Candice.
Yeah, no worries. At least I think last time Tanya and I spoke, my husband was dropping dishes in the background, and that's not as loud as dishes. But I just want to encourage anyone who's out there listening to also, if you have a question, we don't necessarily want to set protocols for it. You can raise your hand, you can write it in the chat. You can also turn your video on to ask. The last thing I just wanted to leave us with is, because I thought that it was also such a nice description. You were speaking about atmosphere. I understand atmosphere as something that envelops us. People use that word to describe, they can say the atmosphere in the room was electric. So it's used to describe a feeling. It's, of course, everything that surrounds us. And it's often, I would say it's actually never really seen. It's always felt. And at the same time, you were speaking of these felt structures. And I was realizing that what you're doing as well is you're setting us up, or you're producing an atmosphere. And then I was thinking, what about this collective breath of all of us, all of these little moments that you're speaking about. You started by describing the push-up as a kind of warm-up in powwow. I think all of us are doing all of these actions all the time. Does that collectively produce an atmosphere? And that makes me, excited to think about sharing that space, sharing that felt structure, let's say, if we wanted to call it that. So I just wanted to thank you for introducing that idea. I'm going to cite one of my colleagues who is here in the room, Claire Butcher. She said to us when we were working on the Toronto Biennial that to share breath is in fact to conspire. And I always thought, when Claire brought that idea that, there's something that feels a little dangerous about that, of course. There's something that feels like, that shared breath could become a resistance movement potentially. So yeah, I was thinking then about this relationship between the atmosphere as the thing that we feel, the thing that we quite literally breathe, and then how that relates to this idea of this shared collective breath to conspire.
Yeah, I think Tommy DeFrance has said that an analytic must be shared for it to do what it needs to do. And I'm really interested in this idea of sort of a counter to settler atmospherics, as Kristen Simmons described. And I'm still looking for more writing around that. And there's been some writing by Megan Scribe and some other folks, but it's a small amount of writing at this point, or maybe I just haven't located some of this sort of theorizing more broadly. But I'm proposing felt structures as, well, primarily Indigenous because I'm Indigenous. I'm Alutuk or Shukpiak, and actually I situate felt structure specifically within an Alutuk sort of experience of that shoreline space, of that coastal zone, because I'm an island person, and there's this sort of continuous shifting and changing that's occurring with weather as an organizing force on my island. That relationship between the land and the ocean and the storms that are consistently sort of coming in to view or affecting our lives. But I also propose that felt structures are a sort of invisible organizing force like weather, but that affect our minds and our ways of thinking about the world. So if we were to view the land as Mother Earth instead of just as a sort of inactive, passive resource that we can extract from, those are two very different ways of looking at the world as a kind of felt structure. And I also mean to say that if we view the earth as a relative or as active and having agency, that also affects the ways in which we feel about the earth or about Turtle Island. And so it's connected to feelings, but also deep belief, deep belief in treaty, deep belief in our place as people in relation to larger groups of folks, or in relation to non-human persons, which could include Mother Earth, could include other beings. And so I've kind of, gone in a few different directions with that response, but yeah, I feel as though it's still coming into being, this idea of felt structures, and so it's still emerging. And I hope to continue to learn more about what I'm proposing, over many years.
Yeah. Well, it's like that idea of like affective knowledge, right? Like that's another form of feeling, of understanding, of, being in relation. The question was kind of all over the place too, so I think your answer was much clearer. And also like this, the way that you're expanding on this idea of what then are settler atmospherics. I think of one example that I know I come back to, but it's really affected me. Like there was a line that our colleague Dylan Robinson wrote for the exhibition Soundings as part of the what we're calling the outdoor curatorial score. This is in Kingston at Queen's University, which, if any of you know it, the feeling there, because of the architecture, I think is very oppressive, because it's not only colonial architecture, it's like faux colonial architecture, because it was replicating a former kind of colonial architecture, particularly that of in the UK. But one of the lines of this outdoor curatorial score was kind of prompting the reader to listen beyond. He asked if it's possible to listen beyond the colonial hum. And then I realized, wow, this hum is everywhere, and I've embodied it to such a level that I didn't realize it was there. And it's like these sub-frequencies as well, right? And so that made me think of, perhaps our sub-frequencies. And I think this is also what you're getting at. Even in your description of a lutic dance as often being short, short as in like you've termed before, like short form. These are kind of like the vibrations and resonances that we have to, it's almost like the ability to gain a kind of more and more and more attunement to the small things. Because I think settler atmospherics want us to be so dull in our senses that we can only pay attention to the biggest things.
Yeah, I feel like that is just quite, you were able to really just sort of bring together some of those ideas and just a kind of clarity around this idea of the hum and the sub-frequency, and sort of reconnect it to this ongoing concern that I think we share with Dylan around listening. So I think you've left me with the kind of way to think about these ideas of short form and insistence and felt structures sort of in a different way, in terms of these sub-frequencies. So I'm going to continue to think about that.
Yeah, and it wasn't a question. It was just kind of like, I felt it in the air, so I had to bring it out. But I wanted to open the floor of the room. If anyone wants to turn on their camera, if anyone has questions, Yeah, and there's some comments, one by Anam. Please feel free. You know, we're a small, intimate group, and that's actually really fun to have, to be able to share amongst all of you. So yeah, if anyone wants to ask anything or say anything or respond in any way, you're more than welcome. Or if you're happy to sit with things too, that's also great. So Julia's turned on her camera. Yeah, I guess, what did I say? One thing I was thinking about when you were speaking, Tanya, too, is, and I know we've talked about this before, but I've always loved this line as well. And this came out of the work that I was doing with the late Bo Dick. And I know this gets repeated quite a bit, but I think about it a lot. And it's this translation of law and justice from a Kwakwaka'wakw perspective. And they said this as a way to make the case for the return of their belongings that were taken during the potlatch. And that line is a strict law bids us dance. And it's translated in English in two different ways. One way is a strict law bids us to dance. And then there's people who dispute that, and it's actually a strict law bids us dance. And I've thought about that a lot because it talks about the irreducible relationship between dance and law, that it's an enactment of a judicial system, that you can't have systems of governance, in fact, if you don't have dance. They were making the case that their system of governance is not only predicated on it, but also predicated on all of those things that accompany dance. And it's like, you know, the regalia that you make, the masks that are made, the dance aprons in the case of Kwakwaka'wakw people. And those are accompaniments, but they're not necessarily the dance at their core. They were the things that were the kind of object of desire for Indian agents, because they thought that if they were to take the masks and the regalia, they could control us. But I know one thing we've spoken about in the past is that you can't take the dances because they're embodied knowledge. So even if, you know, the ceremonies for a time, and they did, had to go underground, or as people say, had to sleep even for as much as 80 years, that's still embodied knowledge. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that to the table because I was thinking about that line, you know, as you were speaking as well, and as you were kind of moved from your first movement into your second, and kind of kept returning, I think, very deliberately to this idea of treaty as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think someone like Robin Gray can speak so well, and Michael D'Angeli, to Tsimshian dance and dance as law. And I think, you know, Dylan speaks briefly about it, or he does speak to it in his text as well, Against Hungry Listening. What I might say is I will share a story from where I'm from, which is in 2005, we had a number of masks return home for an exhibition from the Alphonse Pinart Museum in France. And Alphonse Pinart had collected these masks, I think in the late 1800s. I'd have to go back and take a look. And I remember when I went to the exhibition, I remember looking at the masks, and then some masks I didn't feel comfortable looking at because I think some aren't necessarily they might be meant for specific audiences, and that may not include me. But we don't have that knowledge around them anymore explicitly. But the masks, the lyrics to the songs that accompany the masks were translated from Alutiiq, or my language, Alutiiq language, to Russian, to French, to English, and then back again. And so there was definitely some issues with translation because it was, through so many languages that it was being translated across languages, but also across time. And then the other kind of thing I noticed was that we didn't have the sound that accompanied the masks. The songs no longer accompanied. So song language is a specific kind of language. So different folks in Alaska will tell you that, like Anupiak folks or Yupik folks, there's certain language that is specific to song. And so it's hard to then translate sometimes to sort of regular language because there are different moments in the song where that song language does different things. And so even the structure of the songs were missing, and the song language was probably mistranslated, and then the sound was missing. And so masks function as kind of like doorways or portals. Where I'm from, I know Okwi Okpa Wasili was saying that specifically when we were in a conversation just generally about ancestral belongings. And I would say that that's probably a good way to speak about them, that they have a kind of way in which they are in the world, and there are specific protocols around them, which might be different from Bodik's community or, Tsimshian dances, like specifically Alutiiq. We had, specific protocols around that. And so, yes, the masks were removed. And we have continued to dance. And certainly in the 1980s, there was a lot of work being done to reconstruct dances, to remember dances, to build new dances and songs. And I think that work is really significant. It's very important for our communities and for our peoples. But I do feel as though when I went to that exhibition, I felt that there was something that was missing. Some Indigenous folks will say that that's still retrievable, but maybe not for me. That information isn't necessarily retrievable. So I just wanted to share that as we think about dance as law. There are specific scholars who are and dancers who are writing about that right now, like Michael D'Angeli and Robin Gray.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. Just to speak really briefly, I know that Julie has a question as well in the chat. When we worked with Bodik for an exhibition called Documenta 14, we showed 40 of what are called the Atlakim, or they call them the forest masks, because they're about one story. They're about a story of a boy who goes into the forest and encounters, all of these beings, both of his world, but also supernatural, which are also of his world. And we showed 40 of them. And from what I recall from speaking to him and to Cole Speck and Alan Hunt, who at the time were working as his apprentices, but are artists and in their own right. And Alan is in fact also hereditary chief. There were the final two masks, Bo carved them anyway, even though the songs and the dances had been forgotten. And Bo was one who felt like, and I think he was always doing this, that tradition was a place where you could always push its bounds, and there was invention within it as well. And so he kind of felt like by carving those two masks that the songs would come, whether they were the old ones or new ones. I always thought that was kind of beautiful idea, how they kind of stood as markers of that, of both that past and that future. What Julie's asking is, she's saying that she really likes how we're speaking through the questions you've been holding this year. This is for you, Tanya, holding this year, and how to structure daily life, and how that in essence makes a life. So her question is, she's wondering if you can speak a bit more about that.
So I just wanted to mention that earlier, another individual had also talked about resonances. Claudia had talked about resonances. And I just wanted to say in the chat that what you're speaking about, Candice, to me is really speaking about this idea of resonances, like resonances from the past into this moment and then into the future. So I think it's a really interesting moment that Bo chose to sort of intervene in, the late Bo Dick, to intervene into the sort of that continuum, to sort of, with the intention that those songs will be remembered. I thought that that's a really interesting moment, and to me speaks to this idea of resonances from our ancestors into this moment and into the future. In terms of, like a daily life, I mean, I can speak about this super practically. I can speak about it on lots of different scales. I mean, I was in a conversation with someone recently around writing and making writing sustainable. And one of the pieces of information that she had shared from an academic who coaches people in academic writing was that, you can really just start with 5 minutes a day. And I started to think about that as a kind of practice just generally, which is, when we go on 20-minute walks, or we practice yoga or meditation for 15 minutes, or we, move our body and improvise dance for 20 minutes, or, it's okay to take these moments and make them just for those smaller durations on a daily basis. So I've been thinking about that really super practically, as a person who feels like I've been spending too much time in front of Zooms for the last, 15 or 16 months. But also I would say that, it's journaling regularly. It is sort of holding space within your mind for these ideas that you're spending time with. It's kind of like, we have to have a relationship to our bodies, a relationship to ideas, a relationship to our writing. And so that's really what I've been trying to cultivate on a daily basis, as a way to sort of cultivate a practice, a longer practice. In the past, Candice had talked about how I had undertaken open rehearsals, and I would kind of go into these really intensive situations with dancers where we would make a performance over the course of, 7 days. And then I've never restaged any of those works, but I've documented them so they can be shared on my website as a kind of archive of those performances. Although now, for the first time, documentation is traveling with the Soundings exhibition, documentation of a performance. But I've been thinking about, how do I have a more sustainable practice? How do I continue those relationships with dancers? And so I've been having weekly Zoom rehearsals with them. I've actually started to structure some projects where honoring the fact that we're dispersed, that we're in Montreal and Toronto and North Bay, and Laura's in New York, that I send small cameras to them, and I sort of structure a process where for 2 hours a week, they're investigating a specific set of instructions or prompts that I've sent them, and they're documenting that for only about 2 minutes maybe, and then sending that, so that it allows for a kind of sustained and longer term process over time, where we're meeting consistently, or we're sort of returning to these ideas consistently over time, rather than in these dense sort of bursts where we're together for just maybe 7 days. So it's a way to sort of build a longer work and process. So I've actually done that over a few projects, and I'm undertaking it in 2 right now. So I feel as though that's a way for me to make this manageable for everyone involved. Some of the dancers are mothers, some of them just have other responsibilities, like other kinds of work. And so how can I maintain relationships with them and a practice with them and a sort of continuousness with them that is sustainable and that honors all of the different kinds of responsibilities and obligations that they have and that I have, respectively?
It's a really nice answer. And thank you, Tanya. And also, Claudia, sorry for missing that question in the chat earlier. Tanya, thanks for catching it. I was thinking, maybe you have given us a beautiful entry into what we might do in these in this time after this Zoom meeting and maybe give our eyes a rest and engage our bodies again differently. But Tanya, I wanted to really thank you. I wanted to thank all of the people at Contingencies of Care for helping facilitate, to organize, for all the work doing in front and behind the scenes. Thank you, Ashok, for the introduction, and particularly to Myeonsung Kim for helping organize this as well. So thanks, Tanya. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care.